We have a new Vikings history video out over on Purple Insider. In this one, we go over the greatest pranks of Bud Grant's career, including the time that he fake shot someone. Seriously. Click the card in the upper right corner or the link in the description to learn more. And now, on with our feature presentation. You ever get that feeling when you wake up that everything is going to go wrong? Something sets you off that wasn't supposed to happen. Like you wake up and you get in your car and you drive to work and there's a massive accident that doubles the time of your commute. And you just know right away that this day is going to stink. The logic behind it, by all accounts, doesn't make sense. Everything that happens is an independent event. The calls that you take that day at work or the interactions that your coworkers have with you have nothing whatsoever to do with the length of your commute. And the ingredients in your kitchen that you're thinking about for dinner when you get back, or the stories on the news when you watch that, have no ties whatsoever to your long commute. Whether your commute was super long, super short, or its regular length, everything would have played out exactly the same. However, you just get that feeling. One thing goes wrong that wasn't supposed to, and everything else is going to stink for the rest of the day. You're going to be in a sour mood, and you're not going to be able to do what you wanted to. Well, for the man that you've been watching this whole time, in 1966, that's exactly what happened. This is Pittsburgh Steelers head coach Bill Austin, and prior to an absolutely pivotal game in the season against Washington, he had a horrible feeling that his team was going to stink on this day thanks to some aforementioned events. It's not the first time I've done a video about a disastrous road trip for the Pittsburgh Steelers, as I talked about their horrible Thanksgiving with the flight delay against the Detroit Lions back in 1983, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, at least with that, all of the chaos happened after the game and not before it. This incident from 17 years prior in 1966? Well, it set the tone for the entire disastrous weekend that was to come. Because this is the story behind what might just be, considering the circumstances and considering how it all played out, the worst road trip in the history of the Pittsburgh Steelers franchise. Before I talk about the actual trip in question and how the game itself played out, we need some context to understand the importance of this one and why the Steelers needed to win this one so badly. It's October 2nd, 1966. It's week 4 of the NFL season, and we head to District of Columbia Stadium for this battle in the East between Pittsburgh and Washington. Back in 1966, you had no room whatsoever for error if you wanted to make the playoffs, which in this case was competing for the NFL championship and then a spot in the inaugural Super Bowl. This was the most exclusive playoff field of all time, following the addition of the Atlanta Falcons to increase the number of teams in the league to 15. In the East, where Pittsburgh and Washington resided, there were 8 teams, and only one of them was going to make the playoffs. You already had 2 teams in the Dallas Cowboys and St. Louis Cardinals who had no losses to their name by this point, while the Steelers were 1-1-1, which, while not the worst start to the season, is not an ideal start considering that you have to come in first place. Pittsburgh might be able to afford one more loss the rest of the season. That's it, if they want to have any shot at making it to the playoffs for just the second time in franchise history. So this game against Washington was an absolute must-win. If you drop to 1-2-1 and have just one win in your first 4 games, you have to essentially run the table to have any chance at all of winning the East. And not only was it a big game for that reason, but it was a big game because of the absolutely bizarre nature of the schedule. I don't know why this was the case, but this was one of those rare scheduling quirks where 2 teams played each other in back-to-back weeks. Just a few days before, in week 3, on September 25th, these same 2 teams played over in Pittsburgh, and the Steelers lost that one by a final score of 33-27, thanks to an abysmally sloppy showing offensively, where they turned the ball over 6 times and took a whopping 8 sacks. It's never fun to be swept by a divisional rival. Want to know what's even worse? Getting swept by the same team in a span of 7 days. In other words, this game in DC, which was oddly enough the first road game for the Steelers all season, was a pivotal point in their season. Lose this one, and it all unravels. And like I just said, this was the team's first road game, as in their first 3 games of the season, all of them took place at Pitt Stadium, whether it was their Week 1 game against New York where they tied 34-all, their Week 2 game against Detroit where they won 17-3, or their aforementioned Week 3 game against Washington where they lost 33-27. On top of that, this was the first season that Bill Austin was the head coach of the Steelers, as he was taking over for Mike Nixon following a disastrous 1965 campaign where the Steelers went 2-12 and had the worst offense in all of the NFL. So that's a long, fancy way of saying that this was the first time that the Steelers were ever playing a competitive road game with Bill Austin in charge. And as we're about to find out, there were quite a few kinks to work out that hampered things quite badly. There were quite a few unexpected things on Bill Austin's inaugural road endeavor that set things behind schedule. For one, the Steelers flew to Washington instead of driving. Bit of an interesting decision for 1966, seeing as only 240 miles separate the cities, so you can knock that out in 4 hours. And you might not be saving a ton of time when it comes to getting to the airport and flying and then claiming your bags and then getting to the hotel, especially since air travel back in 1966 was a far cry from what it is today. Still, remember that when a team is traveling to the airport, it's not on one bus. You might be able to fit all of the players on 1 or 2 buses depending on the size of the roster. But you've also got the bus full of equipment. You've got the equipment truck, which is absolutely essential. It's got all of the gear, all of the uniforms, and anything that the players might need in order to play in this game. Well, sure enough, while nothing happened to the players, and they got to the airport on time and ready to depart, the truck did not get there. Because as it turns out, the truck broke down. This meant that you had players waiting eagerly for a takeoff, but it had to be delayed by quite a bit since they had no equipment with them, as they had to wait for the truck to be repaired, which by all accounts took some time. Alright, this first road trip of Bill Austin's tenure with the Steelers is off to a flying start. We've got a delayed flight because of a truck breakdown. But hey, that's okay. Breakdowns and unexpected delays happen. It's part of the risk of traveling. The important thing is that even though the truck was delayed by quite a bit, that the equipment and everything got there eventually, that no one was hurt, and the plane was ready to go after that. Still, following a long day with some unexpected delays, all the players and staff members wanted to do was land in the nation's capital and get to their hotel. The only problem with that? Well, once they got to the hotel, the person working the front desk was confused as to why an entire football team was staying there. Turns out, the hotel lost the reservations. In other words, Bill Austin was living this scene from Seinfeld more than a quarter century before it actually aired.
See, you know how to take the reservation, you just don't know how to hold the reservation. And that's really the most important part of the reservation, the holding. Anybody can just take them.
After a ton of confusion and commotion, the Steelers and the hotel eventually got things figured out. But talk about a dramatic road trip, and a crazy way to start the first of 7 road games that they would play that season. The truck breaks down and causes a delay in the flight, and the hotel loses the reservation, taking what should have been a relatively easy, pain-free commute from Pittsburgh to DC, and turning it into an absolute nightmare. And for head coach Bill Austin, he could sense right away that there was trouble. They were completely screwed. Even though this had no bearing on the actual game whatsoever, seeing as the game was taking place on Sunday, had nothing to do with the plane or the hotel, and they still had time to rest and relax in the hotel and get ready and make any last-minute adjustments, he knew that something just wasn't right. It was one of those road trips where everything that could go wrong did. He had a bad feeling that nothing was going to go his way this weekend. Even if he believed in his team and believed that they had the talent to beat Washington this time, on this day, he knew that luck was not going to be on their side. Said Austin quite bluntly, "I sensed trouble when the truck taking our uniforms to the airport broke down. That meant a delay in the takeoff. And in Washington, the desk clerk lost our reservations." So how did the game itself play out? Was Bill Austin's gut instinct right? Even though the opposing team would have had no way whatsoever of knowing about Pittsburgh's traveling issues? As it turns out, it was. It most certainly was, as you probably could have told from the highlights of the game that you've been watching this whole time, or lowlights if you're a Steeler fan. Because the second verse was the same as the first, as when the final whistle sounded in this one, once again, Pittsburgh was on the losing end of things, as they succumbed to Washington by a final score of 24-10. It was a much lower scoring game than the battle a week ago between the two sides, but it still produced the same final result of putting Pittsburgh's season and title hopes in absolute jeopardy. At no point during the contest did the Steelers hold any sort of lead. The Steelers, after turning the ball over 6 times last week, still had trouble holding on to the ball in this one, as not only did they turn the ball over 4 times, but they forced no turnovers of their own. Good luck winning a game when you've got a turnover margin of -4. Pittsburgh had so much trouble stopping the legendary eventual Hall of Fame quarterback Sonny Jurgensen on the other side, as Jurgensen went 14 for 21 with 262 yards passing, 3 touchdowns, no interceptions, and a passer rating of 149.2. Jurgensen is one of the greatest quarterbacks to ever play this sport, and this game against Pittsburgh in 1966 has a legitimate argument for being the best game of his career, or at the very least, one of them. As for the Steelers quarterbacks, yeah, not so much. Ron Smith started the game and was abysmal, going 10 for 24 with 144 yards passing, no touchdowns, 2 interceptions, and a passer rating of 27.1. He was eventually replaced by George Izzo, who was even worse somehow, going 6 for 17 with no touchdowns, 1 interception, and a passer rating of 21.7. Both of these ratings are worse than if he did nothing but spike the ball into the ground on every single play. Combine that with Pittsburgh's inability to stop Hall of Fame wideout Bobby Mitchell, who had maybe the best game of his career with 6 catches for 150 yards and 2 touchdowns, Pittsburgh's inability to establish the run, as they had a not-so-nice 69 yards rushing on a mere 2.7 yards per carry, and some sloppiness with discipline as they committed 8 penalties, and yeah, this was not a good showing for the Steelers at all. It was an ugly game in what was an ugly weekend that proved all of Bill Austin's intuitions right. And again, the long day on Saturday should not have made a huge difference in the grand scheme of things, seeing as this game was on Sunday, and Washington on the other side had no idea about Pittsburgh's misfortunes in getting there. But it did. It just did. Because that's how life seems to work. This was the day where the Steelers were still in bed at 10 when work began at 8, and where they burned their breakfast. And you just knew that it was going to be one of those days, even though it didn't have to be, because this was a completely independent event. Bill Austin made quite a few road trips in his less than stellar 3 seasons as the head coach of the Steelers, and I think it's safe to say that his first was the worst. Because if your team's bus breaks down, your flight is delayed, and your hotel reservation is messed up, then in the eyes of Bill Austin, you've already lost the game before it's even kicked off. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.